Today we are going to have our Rising Star Spotlight series, and we are glad to welcome Biwei Huang from CMU and Aahlad Puli from NYU as our speakers tonight. I'm your host, Subho from Splunk, and I'll be hosting this session today. The first hour is going to be the talks and question answer, as always. And the next part and the 15 minutes of the next hour is going to be the optional social. The first hour is going to be recorded and live streamed on YouTube. So if you do not want yourself to be appearing in the recording, feel free to drop out and watch the YouTube stream. But the second hour is not going to be recorded or live streamed. So do come back to join us if you have time and share your opinions. Our speakers today are Aahlad and Biwei. Biwei is going to start, and then Aahlad is going to take over for the second hour. Both are going. Today's seminar is going to be themed on the area of causal inference. So we are very excited to listen to both of these talks. Before jumping into the talks, a little bit about our initiative. By now, you guys are probably aware of all the organizers and advisors of our initiative. We are turning one very soon, and we are excited to share a few more new efforts coming in the next few weeks. Our goal has always been to become a gathering place for early career researchers, normal researchers and practitioners, and foster collaboration. So we are excited to work towards that in the coming years, and with all your blessings and encouragements. So without further ado, let's jump into the talks today. As always, feel free to submit a vote or comment on questions, on your own questions, on others' questions in Zoom during the question answers. Our speakers, if they want to, they can stop in the middle of their talk sometime to take questions, or we can defer questions at the end of each of our speakers' talk. So I am going to hand it over to Biwei for our first talk. Biwei, please feel free to share your screen and begin whenever you're comfortable.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me share the screen. Good. Can you see my screen well and hear me well?
Yep, you're all good.
Nice. So hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to talk at TrustML. So I'm a final year PhD student at CMU. So my main work is on causality and causality-related machine learning. So my presentation today is on learning and using causal knowledge, opportunities and challenges. The talk will contain two parts. One is on how to learn causal knowledge from observational data, and the other is on how to use causality to better understand and advance AI. First, you may want to ask why we are interested in the study of causality. Many tasks in science and engineering require causal information. Association alone may not be sufficient. For example, from empirical data, the chocolate consumption and the number of Nobel Prizes show plenty of correlations. Then, does it mean that we can get more Nobel Prizes by eating more chocolate? Well, no, this is not the case. The spurious correlation is due to the ignorance of the common cause economy. So, to increase the number of Nobel Prizes, one way is to improve the economy instead of eating more chocolate. And in neuroscience, it has been hypothesized that some disease models are related to atypical brain connectivities between different brain areas in order to explore our brain functions and therefore to provide better treatments for some disorders, such as autism and bipolar. Now you may want to ask how to find causal relationships. A traditional way of finding causal relationships is by doing randomized experiments. For example, to examine whether a vaccine is effective for COVID-19, the subjects are randomly split into two groups. One is the treatment group, which gets the vaccine, and the other is a control group, which actually gets placebo. So the vaccine is effective if and only if the injection of the vaccine causes the reduced infection rate in the treatment group. However, the problem is that randomized experiments are usually very hard to do, and sometimes it may even involve ethical issues. So we are thinking an alternative way, finding causal relationships from observational data known as causal discovery, because observational data are usually much easier to obtain. Then the question is, how to find causal relationships from observational data in complex systems, which may involve many variables, such as the causal structure between brain areas and that between disease. You may wonder the difference between gradient and causal inference. Where causal inference aims to identify the causal effect given the to widely use a framework, the potential framework to calculus, and we have also seen it from the chocolate Nobel Prize example. In the following, we will see that with additional assumptions and constraints, it's possible to identify causal information from observational data. Let's first have a quick review of the criteria that are useful for causal structure identification. One criterion is the temporal constraints, that the past causes future, which is used in the granular causality. And the second criterion is the conditional independence relationships. It has been shown that under appropriate assumptions, we can draw a connection between the causal structure and the statistical independence. So with this connection, we can now make use of the conditional independence constraints to infer the causal structure. And we call this line of approaches the constraint-based method. But we should be noticed that this line of approaches may only partly identify the causal graph, where some directions may not be determined, such as the direction between x1 and x5 and that between x3 and x5 in this example. Now let's go one step further. Extract asymmetry by leveraging the independent noise condition to determine the causal direction under certain conditions. We assume Y is linearly generated from X with a uniformly distributed noise E, and the cause X is independent of E. So in order to see the asymmetry, we fit a regression model both in the causal direction and in the reverse direction. The red dots are the scatter plot of the predictors. The red dots are the scatter plot of the predictor and the estimated residual. We can see that if we fit the regression model in the causal direction, the independence between the predictor and the estimated residual holds, but it doesn't hold in the reverse direction. We find asymmetry, so we can use such asymmetric independence to identify the causal direction. Another criterion is the asymmetric independent change. If we factorize the joint distribution in the causal direction, then the derived distribution modules, that is, the distribution of the cause and the distribution of the effect given its causes, are changed independently. But such independence generally doesn't hold in the reverse direction. We call the distribution modules, which are factorized according to the causal structure, the causal module. That is, the causal module refers to the conditional distribution of a variable given its direct causes. And we call the property that the causal modules are independent of each other, modularity or autonomy. In the following talk, you will hear the two terms cross-module and modularity quite often. Now we have a rough idea about the criteria that are useful in causal discovery. In the last few decades, multiple solid approaches in causal discovery have been developed based on some of the criteria. However, the problem is that previous approaches to causal discovery usually rely on heavy assumptions. For example, they are designed for IID or stationary data, assume that the causal relations are linear, and assume that there are no hidden confounders or selection bias in the data. But the problem is that in many complex systems, these assumptions may not hold and they are even not testable. Fortunately, in recent several years, much attention has been paid to develop causal discovery methods with weaker assumptions so that they can be applied to more general scenarios. In the following, I will introduce two causal discovery methods to handle the existence of distribution shifts and hidden confounders, respectively. In many cases, the recorded data could be non-stationary. For example, in fMRI data, the data distribution may change along with the attention or the outside stimulus. And such stimulus may act as hidden confounders that influence a large part of the brain regions. And moreover, when we analyze the health data that include exercise minutes, heart rate, energy burned, and so on from different subjects, where each subject may have multiple data points, it is usually the case that the genetic factors influence the measured variables vary a lot of subjects, leading to the varying data distributions across subjects. However, usually the gene data are not available, and directly ignoring such confounders could give us misleading results. So to address the above problems, we developed a principled framework as well as practical methods for causal discovery from non-stationary or heterogeneous data, called CDNOD for short. So CDNOD allows that the heterogeneity is caused by unobserved changing factors or hidden confounders, such as the GC and the theta C here, whose value change across domains or change smoothly over time. So the basic idea of CDNOD is that we represent the hidden changing factors as functions of C, where C can be the domain index, time index, test index, and so on. So we incorporate C into the variable set as a surrogate to characterize the unobserved changing factors. Specifically, we start from a finite V and detect chances to C. And next, we recover the causal skeleton by further testing for the conditional independence relationships between VI and C. So VI has a change module if it is between, yeah. So basically we do the conditional independence test and search and do the search in an efficient manner. And furthermore, we can identify which variables are influenced by the same changing factors. And then next, we orient the causal direction by the independent change principle. That is, the distribution of the cause and the distribution of the effect given cause change independently, but such independence is generally violated in wrong directions. So with the independent change principle, we can identify all the cause directions in this example. But aware that for IID data, we cannot identify any cause direction in such a chain structure unless we constrain the functional class of causal mechanisms. So we are happy to see that distribution shifts actually provide extra information for causal direction determination. And intuitively speaking, it is because heterogeneity can be regarded as a consequence of sort intervention done by nature. And after discovering the causal structure, one may wonder how the causal module changes on PCA to extract a low-dimensional representation of the changes along with C. Good. Now let's move to the second method. So currently, most existing methods focus on causal relations between observed variables. While in many scenarios, the observed ones may not be the underlying causal variables, but are generated by latent causal variables or confounders that are causally related. So in the following, we will focus on causal discovery in such a case. For instance, here, X are the observed variables, and L are latent variables, and L are the hidden confounders that cause X. So given only the observed variables X, we want to locate the latent variables L. So, or in other words, we want to cluster the observed variables. And moreover, we want to identify the causal structure among the latent variables L. One promising application is that in neuroscience, we would like to automatically identify brain functional brain regions, as well as the information flow from hundreds of thousands of voxels. Now let me convey the main idea from this example. Here, Y is a vector containing X1, X2, X3, and Z is a vector containing X4 and X6. So in this case, we can use L1 and L2 to block all the passes between Y and Z. However, the problem is that L1 and L2 are hidden. So then what can we do now? Fortunately, we find that we can use a particular linear combination of Y to remove the influences from its hidden confounders to make it independent of Z. We see Z and Y follows the gene condition, the generalized independent noise condition, if such a linear combination exists. And moreover, we can draw a connection between the gene condition and the graphical properties of the variables. With a connection between the gene condition and the graphical criteria, we can then identify the latent variable graph by testing the gene condition. And specifically, we leverage a two-step algorithm. In the first step, we find the causal clusters, that is, locate the latent variables by testing the gene condition. And in the second step, we identify the causal order of the latent variables by further making use of the gene condition. Okay, now I think we have seen several methodological developments in causal discovery. With additional constraints or assumptions, we can find causal information from observational data. The next topic is that how causality helps better understand and advance machine learning and AI. Let's first have a look at several properties of causal models. First, knowing the causal graph, we can understand the cause and effect relationships. For a target variable, we can know which factors will influence it and which factors will be influenced by it. And another very important property is modularity. So given the causal graph, we can factorize the joint distribution into causal modules. So basically, modularity says causal modules are independent of each other. If we change the causal module of V2, the causal module of other variables will not be affected. The third nice property is that given the causal model, we can not only do prediction using association, but also predict under intervention and do counterfactual reasoning, which has been called the three-layer causal hierarchy. Now let's think of leveraging several of the above properties in the task of transfer reinforcement learning that aims to make quick adaptations when faced with new environments. The basic idea is that we leverage a parsimonious graphical representation to characterize the structural relationships of different among variables in the system, including the structures of different state dimensions of the states S, the reward variable R, the action variable A, and the observed images O. Moreover, instead of learning the distribution shift over the high dimension input, thanks to the graphical representation, we introduce a low dimensional vector theta k to characterize the domain-specific information in a compact way. So in this example, the domains are different in rotations and corrupted widely. So we can use a two-dimensional vector to characterize the changes, in which one dimension is for the rotation and the other is for the white noise. So we have seen that graphical representation provides us a compact way to encode what and where the changes are. Specifically, from the graph structure, we can know which state dimensions are necessary for action prediction. In this example, only S1 and SD are needed because they influence the future reward. And moreover, we can know where the changes are and which changes should be adapted instead of adapting the high dimensional joint distribution as a whole. In this example, only the rotation that is captured by theta S need to adapt, but not the white noise captured by theta R, because it doesn't affect the future reward. And in addition, with the property of modularity, each factor can be considered separately, which avoids the curse of dimensionality. So in the target domain, we only need a few samples to learn the value of the rotation and directly derive the optimal policy in the target domain without policy optimization. We have seen that the graph knowledge provides more efficient adaptation. And furthermore, by knowing where and how the changes are, we can not only make the impact, but it was more active adaptation. Finally, let me summarize several key points in this talk. So we have seen that with appropriate constraints, we can find the causal relationships from observational data. Particularly, we find that different types of independence help in causal discovery, including conditional independence, the independent noise condition, and the independent change between causal modules. And we further show how causality can help to better understand machine learning and AI tasks by leveraging the graphical representations, the modularity property, and the three-layer causal hierarchy. Let me finally finish the talk by listing several of the challenges in the causality community. So one challenge is hidden causal representation learning. Most causal discovery approach assume that the causal variables are known and observed. However, for machines with high dimensional images as input, obviously it is not the case. So one question is, under which conditions and how can the machines automatically learn the underlying low dimensional causal variables from high dimensional inputs, as well as identify the causal relationships between the unobserved causal variables? And another very important problem is how to efficiently validate the learned causal knowledge, which is especially important for scientific research. And also, currently in the causality community, we don't have mature benchmark data sets. It's important to have benchmark data sets with verified causal relationships. So here's the causality group at CMU, and thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Biwei, for the very interesting talk. So to the audience members, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or post it in the Q&A, and I can ask that as well.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. So a couple slides ago about the graph.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
like
here.
In the first part,
sorry, in the second, yeah, like 32. Okay. So
yeah.
do we need some prior knowledge about how this graph should be constructed?
So actually, we learn the graph from data.
I see.
So we don't have prior knowledge here. For the reinforcement learning problem, there are some knowledges about the course directions. For example, it's always the past state causes the future state. And also, always it's the state causes the reward, but not the reverse.
Okay, but the relationship between domain-specific parameters to the domain shared representations are learned.
Sorry, could you, do you mean the graph in this slide?
Yeah, the links between domain-specific parameters to domain shared representations, these are learned from the data.
Yes.
Yes.
So they are learned from the data. So to characterize the changing factors across domains.
Yes.
And the domain shared, so basically in this example, we observe the high dimensional images and we learn the underlying state variables and also the change factors.
Cool. Thanks.
Sure, thank you.
So Biwei, we have a question in the Q&A that do you have a GitHub repo available for this work for the code?
Yeah, so I can share my GitHub repo. But I think in 1 week or 2 weeks, we will public a Python package for causal discovery, which contain most of the state art of the causal discovery approaches.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So do I need to send the link here?
You can, yeah, if you can share your, if you are comfortable sharing your own GitHub right now, you can do that. Yeah, otherwise,
sure.
Whenever you are, you can share that with us and we can post that as a follow-up.
Yeah, so this is my my GitHub repo, and so in 1 or 2 weeks we will public a Python package for causal discovery approaches.
Yeah, the screen is not shared.
Yeah, you might need to share it with everyone in the chat.
Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, it still shows the slides.
Oh.
You can just copy paste it
now?
and post it in the chat.
Okay,
yeah, we have it in the chat. And
share.
Aditya shared itself. All right, so I think we do have your GitHub repo. Let me share it with everyone as well. Okay, and I think now we can move on to our second speaker. Thanks a lot, Biwei. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Enthusiasm. So Aahlad, please feel free to take over and begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Subho. Can you guys see my screen and not anything else? Sorry.
You're good. Yep.
Hi, all. Thank you for having me. I will be talking about predictive modeling in the presence of nuisance-induced spurious correlations. This is joint work with Lily Zhang, Eric Oerman, and Rajesh Ranganath, who, along with me, are also at NYU. We have seen machine learning be successful at a lot of tasks in the last decade. Examples include image recognition, dense captioning, and tasks in natural language processing like sentiment analysis and natural language inference. One key assumption behind this success is that data at training and test time come from the same distribution. This, however, may not hold in the real world because of the presence of spurious correlations. Biwei gave a fantastic example about spurious correlations connecting chocolate and Nobel Prizes. For our purposes, spurious correlations are correlations between label and the covariates that change across time or geography. For example, in many data sets of images, you see cows appear on grass. However, this is not always true. So models may learn to predict cow based on the background, and when the background changes, models will fail to predict cow correctly. Similar examples occur in chest X-rays, where hospital or scanner-specific information is encoded in the X-ray and may be leveraged by a model to predict pneumonia, even when there is no pneumonia inside the lung. In the task of natural language inference, shared words across the premise and hypothesis sentences are also a spurious correlation. In the presence of spurious correlations, optimal models for one distribution, for example, your training data, can perform poorly under changes due to spurious correlations. However, we can only guarantee generalization under assumptions about such changes. One such assumption includes the example that differences between hospitals affect X-ray noise or texture, but not the physiological content inside the lung. So let's dive into that. Consider this example where your training data has cows on grass backgrounds and penguins on snow backgrounds. And in your test data, the backgrounds are flipped. The two distributions are not the same. But in this case, the two distributions are not the same because of a specific relationship between the background and the label. Here we call the background a nuisance because it does not contain semantic information about cows or penguins. In the examples we saw earlier, in chest X-rays, the non-lung regions are nuisances for detecting diseases inside the lung. In natural language inference, the shared words across the sentences are nuisances that are correlated with entailment. Under such nuisance-induced spurious correlations, our goal is to predict well, even when the nuisance-label relationship changes arbitrarily. So let's define nuisance-induced spurious correlations. Starting off with a bit of notation, Y is the label, Z is the nuisance, and X are the covariates. With this, we define a nuisance varying family, which is a collection of distributions that only differ in the nuisance-label relationship. So indexed by capital D, the distribution in this family, any distribution in this family, is factorized as follows, where the marginal of Py and the conditional of X given Z comma Y are fixed, but the conditional distribution of Z given Y changes. Z given Y is our nuisance-label relationship. With the family defined, we assume the training data comes from one member, while the test data can come from any other member. And we assume all variables are known during training, but the nuisances, Z, may not be known at test time. At this point, you may ask me where I get these nuisances from. I will discuss in the experiments how knowledge about the data set or the domain helps specify nuisances from the data itself, from a single data set. So let me restate the goal with the nuisance varying family defined. We want to predict well on every member of the family. So to define performance, we will use the negative expected KL between the target conditional P test Y given X and any model P hat that you learn. Higher is better. So to not use the nuisance in predicting the label, we should break the nuisance-label relationship in the data that we train on. So to this end, we define the nuisance-randomized distribution denoted by P subscript independent. So as you can see in the factorization, Z is not distributed conditionally on Y. In such a distribution, we can predict with the nuisance-randomized conditional P independent Y given X. We can show performance guarantees for this predictor if X is uncorrelating. Uncorrelating is the property that conditional on X, the label and the nuisance are independent. A natural question here is, what if X is not uncorrelating? If X is not uncorrelating, the nuisance randomized predictor can perform worse than chance. I have a simple example here where the nuisance varying family is defined using a generative process indexed by a scalar A, which determines the nuisance label relationship. In this family, you have high accuracy using the nuisance randomized predictor on the nuisance randomized distribution, but when you predict on the test distribution, you have poor accuracy. Here, the test distribution is defined by A equals -1. So why does this happen? When X is not uncorrelating, nuisance becomes predictive when conditioning on the covariates. This is bad because changes in the nuisance label relationship change the part of the covariates used in prediction. But even when X is not uncorrelating, we can find representations that are uncorrelating. In the earlier example, the sum of the two coordinates of X is one such representation. Formally, an uncorrelating representation satisfies the property that conditional on the representation, the label and the nuisance are independent, similar to the property we stated earlier. For any uncorrelating representation, we can characterize the performance as follows. The performance of the nuisance randomized conditional on RFX is equal to the performance of the marginal predictor, which is the performance of predicting by random chance, plus a non-negative term. This immediately gives us a lower bound on the performance. One thing to note here is that representations that are not uncorrelating can also perform worse than random chance. But recall that our goal was to predict well on every test distribution in the nuisance varying family instead of just lower bounding it. So next, I will characterize simultaneous optimality within the set of uncorrelating representations. So we have a theorem showing an optimal representation and giving us an idea about how to match the performance of that representation. I will go through this step by step. So the first step is that a maximally blocking uncorrelating representation is simultaneously optimal. So let R star be maximally blocking, which is the property highlighted in orange. It says that R star and Z satisfy the property that when conditioning on R star and Z, every uncorrelating representation is independent of the label. So intuitively, you're blocking the connection between uncorrelating representations and the label. This property is sufficient to guarantee the performance of R star is at least as good as any other uncorrelating representation. It turns out a maximally blocking representation is also information maximal on the nuisance-randomized distribution. This gives a characterization of optimal performance based on a single distribution that we may leverage. But is this unique? It turns out that information maximality on the nuisance-randomized distribution also implies simultaneous optimality. So the term in blue here implies information maximality because R star is information maximal and any R prime that matches R star should also be information maximal. And this is enough to guarantee that R prime matches the performance of R star, which we have already shown to be simultaneously optimal on every test distribution. The key idea in this for the rest of the talk will be the operationalization of the condition in blue of finding the information maximal uncorrelating representation on the nuisance randomized distribution. I can pause for a bit if there are questions. Okay. No questions?
Feel free to continue, Aahlad. To those who are listening in, please post your questions anytime in the Q&A while Aahlad is speaking.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Subho. Moving on. Using the insight from earlier, we develop an algorithm. We call it Nuisance-Randomized Distillation, or NuRD for short. The NuRD has two steps. The first is nuisance randomization, which is to break the nuisance label relationship to produce a nuisance randomized data set. Once you have this nuisance randomized data set, we can build the most informative uncorrelating representation by maximizing likelihood. Okay, so the first step, nuisance randomization, we give two recipes. The first is reweighting randomization, which follows from the insight that the nuisance-randomized distribution can be written as an importance-weighted version of the training data. Once you see this insight, you can learn the models in the weight and importance weight the training loss. The second recipe is generative randomization, which follows from the insight that the conditional of x given y comma z is fixed across all members of the family, meaning that you can learn it from the training data. So once you learn a conditional generative model for x, you can generate x from the nuisance randomized data by conditionally generating based on independent labels and nuisances. Given an estimate of the nuisance randomized data, we can find the most informative uncorrelating representation via distillation. The key step here is to maximize likelihood of the label from a representation under a conditional information penalty to enforce uncorrelating representations. So you will notice that the expectation and the information are defined based on the nuisance randomized data from step 1, which is why there's a little hat there. The problem here is that this objective can have local minima at functions of the nuisance, which turn out to be uncorrelating, but not informative of the label. So we want to get rid of these. To do that, we can enforce joint independence, which is the property of the label, the joint random variable, the label, and the representation being independent of the nuisance. Enforcing this joint independence avoids functions of the nuisance. This joint independence is simply the uncorrelating property plus marginal independence between the representation and the nuisance. So once you see this, NuRD's distillation objective is a maximum likelihood objective penalized by joint independence. The term in blue is maximum likelihood, and the term in green is a penalty based on mutual information to enforce joint independence. This mutual information will be estimated using the classification-based density ratio trick, which is popular. With the algorithm set up, I will move on to the experiments next. The first experiment, we set up a generative process similar to the example we saw before, where the label is Bernoulli distributed, the nuisance is normal given the label, and x, the covariates, are bivariate with y minus z in the first coordinate and y plus z in the second coordinate. Here, the training data is generated with a equals 0.5, and the test data is generated with a equals minus 0.9, which are opposite relationships between z and y. So the results for this and all experiments are mean and standard error of accuracies over 10 seeds. Turns out that the training and the difference between the training and the test data is enough to make ERM perform worse than random chance. Because y is Bernoulli 0.5, random chance will give you an accuracy of 50%. In contrast to ERM, both generative NuRD and reweighting NuRD achieve close to 60% accuracy. In the second experiment, we work with a restricted version of the colored MNIST dataset, where we only use zeros and ones. This dataset is created by coloring MNIST images in such a way that the color is more strongly correlated with the label than the shape of the digit itself. We have equal number of ones and zeros in both training and test, which gives you a marginal probability of 1 and 0 being 0.5. In the training data set, we let 90% of the zeros be red and 90% of the ones be green. And in the test, this relationship is flipped, where only 10% of the zeros are red and 10% of the ones are green. The oracle accuracy, which is the optimum achievable based on shape, is 75% due to the construction of the data set itself. We use the most intense pixel in the image as the nuisance. And ERM, due to the strongly correlated color and label, performs poorly on the test data, achieving only a 10% accuracy. On the other hand, both generative NuRD and reweighting NuRD achieve close to the optimal accuracy of 75%. Our third task is differentiating water birds and land birds. We create a data set by filtering from Segawa et al. 2019. This data set is created to ensure that the background of the image is correlated with the label. So water birds appear more often on water backgrounds and land birds appear more often on land backgrounds in the training data. But in the test data, this relationship is flipped. So specifically, 90% of water birds, in the training data, 90% of the water birds appear on water and 90% of land birds appear on land. In the test, however, this relationship is flipped. We construct a gold standard model for this data set. We build models for land backgrounds and water backgrounds and use those models to predict on separate subsets of the test data. This is strictly extra information because we, in our experiments with NuRD, we don't use this information. As the nuisance, we use the outermost pixels as the nuisance because in most of the images, the birds appear in the central patch. In this experiment, ERM performs at 60%, while reweighting NuRD achieves close to the gold standard accuracy. Our last experiment is predicting pneumonia from chest X-rays, where we create a data set by mixing two popular chest X-ray data sets, Mimic and CheckSpurt. The training data has 90% cases from Mimic and 90% normal cases from CheckSpurt, while in test data, only 10% of the pneumonia cases are from Mimic and 10% normal are from CheckSpurt. For this experiment, because chest X-rays are usually centered, we use the outermost pixels, which correspond to non-lung patches as the nuisance. In this experiment, ERM achieves only a 30% test accuracy, while reweighting NuRD achieves close to 60%, significantly beating ERM. So toward the end, I want to add a quick remark on perception tasks. Perception tasks like classifying water birds can be perfectly solved by humans, domain experts, for example. But if nuisances do not perfectly predict the label, ERM should ignore nuisances in theory and give you perfect accuracy, which is perfect accuracy that is generalizable across test distributions. But due to finite sample model bias issues or optimization issues, ERM uses nuisances in practice, as we show in the water birds experiment. Finally, a large body of work has tackled spurious correlations in the recent years. I list 3 requirements here that the existing methods cannot handle without extra work or assumptions. I have listed different kinds of methods here. And I will go through each column first. And then if we have time, I can talk about the individual methods themselves. The first column is the ability to handle multiple non-overlapping environments. Typically in the literature, environments are collections of subsets of the training data that we assume to have different spurious correlations. What does non-overlapping environments mean? It's that the covariate support is disjoint across environments. NuRD does not require the training data to be split into different environments, so can handle multiple non-overlapping environments. The second requirement is the ability to handle high-dimensional nuisances. Existing methods can use nuisances to define environments or subgroups. When you have high-dimensional nuisances, these methods can become ineffective, but NuRD does not have such a failure mode. Finally, the third column corresponds to the ability to not only use training time nuisances without access to test time nuisances. Most methods do not assume test time nuisances except shift stable prediction. NuRD can handle the absence of test time nuisances. But if you are given test time nuisances, our theory gives an exact recipe of what to do. That's my talk. I want to thank my collaborators, Lily Zhang, Eric Eierman, and Rajesh Anganath. This paper should go up online, but if you want a draft, you can email me at aahlad@nyu.edu. Thank you.
Thanks, Aahlad, for your talk. And I see Lily is there as well as part of our panelists. So to the attendees. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And either of our panelists, Aahlad or Lily, will be happy to answer.
Yeah, I have a very simple question. So what does high dimension neurons mean? So you are muted.
Let me share my screen and show an example.
Mm-hmm.
So in our X-ray experiment, we use the outer pixels of the image as the nuisance. So this is 4 by 32 times 4. So that's a high dimensional nuisance. Because we don't use any restrictions on the nuisance in either theory or algorithm, NuRD can handle high dimensional nuisances.
I see. So it's like the directly the features of the data.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, so those not high dimension nuisances are like more like, for example, the labels of the data set, like batch IDs, data set ID, domain IDs, stuff.
Yes. So there are some of the related methods assume that you have a discrete label for the nuisance. For example, group DRO and some recent causally inspired methods both do that. Both in theory and in practice, they assume the discreteness of nuisances.
Oh, I see. So they have to be discrete also. It's not just a low dimension.
Yeah, discrete. I think you could probably discretize a continuous nuisance, but that may have issues that are beyond the theory in these papers.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, thanks.
So Aahlad, I had a question. Not sure if you have heard about these people's work. So their line of work is essentially a method called invariant risk minimization. I think it's a group PM research. So that also seems pretty contextual to what you do. So yeah, I was just wondering that if you have looked into any intersection or any comparisons with your method.
I have not looked at comparisons. So let me mention this. In this row called invariant learning, I include IRM, which is the link here. So the primary difference, I would say, off the bat is that these methods assume that the training data is split into multiple environments. So they assume that you have, for example, if you take colored MNIST, they assume that the color label relationship is different in each of these environments. For NuRD, we don't require that multiple environment relationship. So we can work from a single environment. And more importantly, you have to make the assumption that your environments come from the same support. All of them have the same support. NuRD does not require this because we don't split our data to begin with.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. So I have I can share the slides, but I have only listed one example of each of these methods. But the idea is whenever you have some kind of environment contrast where you have a model that predicts one well in one, and that would imply worse in the other, that requires overlapping supports. Because otherwise you can just have two predictors that simultaneously maximize performance on both.
Any questions for either Aahlad or Biwei from our audience? Other questions going once, going twice, going thrice. All right. In that case, Aahlad, thank you so much for joining us, and Biwei also thank you to you too as well for joining us and sharing your recent work. Please feel free to stick around for the social and interact with the audience members in a more free-form fashion.
Thanks for having us.
Certainly.